as I've been wonderfully introduced by everybody, I'm Alfie, and I am currently a Masters in Research student in biology, predominantly looking at wetland restoration and ecology with Bangor University. So a little bit about me to sort of kick things off. So I've always been around the Cheshire area. I went to secondary school in Alsager, and I grew up in around that area and in Stoke-on-Trent. I've worked in an exotic pet shop, so I've got a lot of hands-on experience with animals. And I went to Reeseheath College in Nantwich, where I'd studied animal management and really started to sort of cement my career involved in animals. Whilst I was there, I was really fortunate I got to do some work experience at Limassol Zoo in Cyprus, which was really good fun. And I got to look at some of the little conservation projects that they do out there with Egyptian fruit bats and griffin vultures and stuff like that. So sort of getting a bit of a hands-on conservation experience. After college, I took a year out, and I was really fortunate to work in the Philippines for 4 months in conservation with this mammal here, which is the Philippine tarsier. Which are really cute, sort of little, almost like bush baby creatures. And I went to Italy with WWF Policoro and got to do some whale and dolphin watching, all those sorts of things. I also worked in a preschool and after school club, so I've got a bit of an experience in the educational side of things as well. And next to that, I've worked in pubs and restaurants. And then after my year out, I went to Bangor, where I did my undergraduate, and I got a Bachelor of Science honorary degree in zoology with animal behaviour. And I was really fortunate to travel to India and Tenerife. So I've been really lucky to sort of travel to all fascinating places and see all the different kinds of wildlife that are there, which has sort of helped me develop my interest in biodiversity and what is around the world. And now, like I said, I'm doing my Masters in Research, and I'm also a pizza chef at the same time because we all need to make a bit of money. So just as a bit of a fun thing, because I wanted to try and demonstrate the variety of life that we find at the Chester Wetland Centre, that throughout this entire talk, I want you to see how many different species you can spot. So this is just so you get an idea of the sort of thing that I do in the field, but you're going to do it on presentation slides instead. So just an overview of this an overview of the presentation. So I'm going to be talking about what the Chester Wetland Centre is and the bigger picture. I'm going to have a bit of an overview of all my research, and then I'm going to talk about why habitat restoration, why wetlands specifically, and why biodiversity. And then I'll talk a bit more in depth about my research that's involved with Chester Wetland Centre and the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve. And then we'll talk about how you guys can help and the overall outcomes and objectives of my research. So first and foremost, what is the Chester Wetland Centre? So I'm going to launch a poll for you all now to ask how many of you have heard about the Chester Wetland Centre. So there's 3 options on there, just to get an idea of how many people have heard about it. So it's live now, so if you could all just find the poll and give it a vote. Wow, super. So we've got quite a few people that haven't heard about Chester Wetland Centre whatsoever. We've got a few people that have heard about it but not had a chance to visit it, which hopefully once lockdown restrictions and everything ease a bit more and there's a bit more freedom of travel, you can all get there to visit it because it's a fantastic place. I am biased though, and there's a few of you that have visited as well. So the Chester Wetland Centre. This is the master plan of the Chester Wetland Centre that is actually taken from the slides for the launch of this project. So the Chester Wetland Centre is in the Countess Chester Country Park, which you can see here, and this is the specific Chester Wetland Centre area, with the predominant goals to restore or create wetland habitats, a wet meadow and a grazing marsh, to provide an area of potential continuous research where there can be education involved to increase and preserve biodiversity, for carbon sequestration, so how much carbon can a wetland take out of the atmosphere and pump back into itself, to improve water quality going through the area of Finchett's Gutter, to mitigate some of the flood. I don't know if you remember a few weeks back, we had some severe flooding, which flooded all down this area here, and that was quite bad. So whether this can prevent or at least mitigate some of the flooding. And it's also part of this larger sort of green corridor project. So going on to that green corridor project, it's sort of a big sort of wildlife connections trail, which is occurring, that goes from the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve circled there and runs, follows the route of Finchett's Gutter, which is a small man-made stream that was originally built for agricultural purposes, from what I understand. And it runs parallel with the Shropshire Union Canal. Goes through the Chester Wetland Centre and the Countess of Chester Country Park, and goes further on through to the Northgate Ponds along the Millennial Greenway and the Chester Super Trees right in the middle of Chester. Now, the Chester Wetland Centre itself is divided into different habitats. So a phase 1 habitat survey was conducted at the start of my research, because we have to know what's actually there, what's going on. So we have a marsh grassland, which is indicated with the purple lines, a semi-improved neutral grassland, a native species-rich, slightly defunct hedgerow, and a eutrophic open running water, which is Finchett's Gutter, the stream. Now, this is important because we need to know the habitat to be able to sort of start to make almost assumptions as to what wildlife we might see, the plants, the animals, so on and so forth. So going into my research. So my research is looking at the Chester Wetland Centre and the long-term biodiversity surveying of a site where habitat restoration work will take place. It's looking at the differences in spring biodiversity of 2 wetland habitats at different stages of restorative action. So one where there's been no restoration work and one where there's been restoration work. I'm looking at the use of citizen science as a tool to collect data for biodiversity and how to create effective and engaging scientific communication, which is all something that hopefully you'll all be part of tonight. So to go a bit more in depth, so the long-term biodiversity surveying, we want to look at whether it yields more useful data because we've got a better understanding of the animals, plants, and their functions with the ecosystem, or whether all that data is going to swamp us down. We're looking at how our understanding of these organisms can help with the restoration, potentially, to identify any non-native and potentially invasive species, because that's a really big part in conservation these days. And to identify the species preferred habitats so that when there's construction work going on, how can we mitigate the impacts of what animals are we going to lose or plants are we going to lose, what are we going to gain? Because we're changing habitats here, hopefully, in the future. So I've got a hypothesis for my comparative study with the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve, which I will go into in more detail. And that's that wetland habitat where restorative action has taken place will host a greater diversity of flora and fauna than a wetland where there's been no restorative action. So that's quite simply looking at these 2 sites at different levels of restorative action. Is one, i.e. the one where there's been restorative action, going to host a greater variety of life? And can that restored wetland filter water better? And can it sequestrate carbon better as well, or hold more carbon? Citizen science side of things. So for those of you that aren't familiar with citizen science is basically a collection and analysis of data relating predominantly to the natural world by members of the general public, i.e. you, that's usually used with scientists or on projects, the scientists being me. And so I'm looking at how citizen science can be used effectively as a tool to gather biological data, and then to see whether this can help in long-term monitoring of a site where restoration's taken place. And a big citizen science organisation is Record, who is hosting tonight. And then the creating effective and engaging scientific communication. So I'm trying to create talks which successfully communicate the aims and objectives of my research, that are also audience appropriate, so all of you guys, and comply with the aims of the Institute. So tonight that's Record for their event, and to increase awareness of current research, to encourage involvement and participation where appropriate. So it's looking at scientific information. We don't want it to be too complex that you all get bored and fall asleep, which I hope none of you have already. We don't want it to be too simplistic either, that it sort of loses its meaning on what I'm trying to get across. So it's that nice little Goldilocks area where it's informative and it's engaging. But why habitat restoration? So I'm going to launch another poll, which is basically just asking how many of you have heard the term habitat restoration before. So there's the option of yes, there's an option of yes, but you're not too sure what it means, and then there's the no option as well. So yeah, so habitat restoration, a lot of you have heard about the terminology before, and some of you have heard about it, but you're not too sure on its meaning. It's one of those that has been battered around in the media quite a lot over the past few years, and it's sort of an umbrella term. It can involve any number of words: restoration, recreation, creation, improvement. They all mean sort of a similar thing. So the main goals, well, the main reason of habitat restoration is to achieve specific goals of that project, which will aid in the habitat being in or as close to a natural state as possible. So that goes to show it's a very broad subject, that it's the specific goals. So whether that could be to increase the specific habitat type, because these are the main three reasons, to increase or improve the ecosystem services. So it's the different services that that specific ecosystem gives us. So whether it's water filtration, whether it's food, whether it's travel, the ecosystems can provide lots of different services, or whether it's species conservation, whether that's a specific species or a whole host of species. So then again, I'm now going to do another poll. Which is for you guys, there's no right or wrong answers, but what do you think is the most important reason for habitat restoration out of those three that I've just listed? So there's no right or wrong, like I've said. It's just a bit of an idea whether you think it's to increase that specific habitat type, or whether it's the services that that habitat can provide to us. So that's more of an anthropogenic side of things, or whether it's the species that we find. So that's looking really even. So quite a lot of you, well, most of you seem to have gone for the species conservation, which is really nice for me to hear because that's the side of things that I'm looking more at. But like I said, there's no right or wrong answers. And to increase or improve that specific habitat, that's usually one that it is a goal, it is a big aim, but it's usually classed as a secondary one. And same with the species conservation. It's usually, if they're going to conserve one species, they just hope that other ones will, or they, you know, the other species will be conserved. A lot of the time, it tends to be the ecosystem services because that's how it can directly benefit and impact humans and our behaviours, whether it's to save money through flood mitigation or through the taking in of carbon from the atmosphere or increasing oxygen. And also like for fish stocks and stuff when we look at rivers in Scotland. But why restore, create, and improve habitats? And what habitats do we choose? So I'm not going to list all the different habitats that we find in the UK because we'd be here for ages. But I'm going to tell you about one, which is a group of habitats, really, and that's wetlands. And to quote my research supervisor, Dr. Christian Dunn, he says that wetlands are like the superheroes of habitats for lots of different reasons. So they're not quite aquatic and they're not quite terrestrial. They're sort of a squishy bit in between, which I'm quoting him again. And surprisingly, in the UK, we've lost a lot of wetlands. So it's actually one that's, it's a habitat that's quite high conservation value, really. So only 3% of the UK land is covered in wetlands these days, which is now 80% decrease in the last millennia. And back in the Roman times, it's thought that up to a quarter of the UK was wetlands. So that's including the sort of the Cheshire region and Manchester and Liverpool, a lot of East Anglia, Yorkshire. There's lots of all the sort of moors, a lot of the coastal areas were all wetlands. They provide a whole host of ecosystem services. That includes food, whether it's fishing for, I know we don't really eat them as much anymore, but eels, also lots of different mammals over the years have sought refuge in wetlands to improve water quality because they're a natural filtration system, to mitigate flood because they slow the flow of water and can hold more water as well. Coastal protection is a really big one because those wetlands reduce the amount of erosion on the coast, and wildlife protection is a big one. But another big ecosystem service is the way that we can use them for climate change. So pristine peatlands, which is just one of the many types of wetland habitats, are the most proficient carbon store, and that they contain 455 pg of carbon, and that's twice the amount found in the world's forest biomass. So if you think about how many pristine peatlands might be around the world, and you compare that to all the forests in the UK, the Amazon, all along the equator in Africa with the likes of the Democratic Republic of Congo, if we look at Southeast Asia, all those forests, that is twice the amount of what the forests will take in a peatland. So if you think all the wetlands in the world, how much carbon can we be storing? And the big thing, like I mentioned in the ecosystem services, is biodiversity. So UK sort of figure, 10% of all UK species are found within wetlands, but only 3% of the UK is covered in wetlands. And we also find a lot of species which we only find in those habitats, like the vulnerable fen raft spider in the UK, which is one of our biggest species of spider. So why biodiversity? So I'm now going to take you on to the final poll. A lot of polls in a short space of time, I do apologise. And this is how many of you have heard the term biodiversity. So it's yes, but not sure on its meaning, and no, not whatsoever. That's super. So most of you seem to have heard and understand the meaning of biodiversity. So why I'm choosing biodiversity is that the biodiversity and its protection, maintenance and improvement is classed as a central tenet of conservation because of their ecosystem function relationships. But the use of it in conservation is still not fully understood. And here's one from BBC News from last year, and that there's been a 68% fall in more than 20,000 populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish since the 70s. Now, that's not including insects and other invertebrates either. So there is actually that percentage fall could potentially be much, much greater. So this is quite important. But biodiversity, to use its dictionary definition, is the variety of plant and animal life in the world or in a particular habitat, with a high level usually being desirable or important. So the ecosystem function relationship and biodiversity, the relationship that they have, is clear relevance in the design of the habitat restoration, but its incorporation into habitat restoration is still quite unclear. So this is where the wetlands, the habitat restoration, the biodiversity now all come to one. And this includes, but isn't solely, species richness, which is simply the number of different species, which is what people tend to think about when they think of biodiversity, is the species richness. How many different plants and animals is there? Where it's a bit deeper than that, where it's down to how do those animals influence and maintain an ecosystem, and how does it run smoothly, from our species that are recyclers to our species that are pest control. There's a whole host of ways that it's all interlinked and intertwined. But what information do we want or need to know, and how do we get that information? So if we look at the Chester Wetland Centre, now this is actually now out of date because I've been on the site today, and there's actually new species that I've identified being at the site today. So this is a pie chart of the number of different species, so the species richness that we see at the moment. So Magnoliopsida, which is one of your plant families, along with the Liliopsida here in yellow, there's 49 species of plants with 6 species of grasses and stuff like that. So that's quite a lot of plants there. We've also seen 23 different species of birds, 12 different species of arachnid, the majority being spiders, and 24 different species of insects. And this is the one that's predominantly out of date. But you can also see where there's a wetland habitat already there, we see a lot of species which prefer wetter habitats, such as gastropods or slugs and or snails. And as of the making of this slide, there is 138 different species identified at the site already. So that's already quite a lot. And we're hoping that now spring and summer is coming, we'll see even more. So one of the things we need to know with our ecosystem function, relationships and biodiversity is how is the site being used? So we need to know what's breeding, and these slugs are clearly showing that. We need to know whether things are going to be nesting or whether they're grooming. And this is a common snipe area where they've been grooming themselves and plucking their feathers. And we need to know what's nesting, like these magpies. And other things that are signs of animals being here, like this vole latrine. So if you can see right in the middle, those are the vole droppings. And there is multiple vole latrines over the site. So we know we've got voles. We know we've got common snipe because they've left the tracks to tell us that they're there. But it's not just all about the diversity and richness of species. There's lots of other things that can impact what we find there. The soil is a big impact because wetlands and wetland species prefer nutrient-poor soil. And if we've got water that's pumping in lots of nutrients and the soil is very nutrient-rich, we're not going to see what we'd expect to see. The water is another big part of it. So what pollutants, such as metals, and how much nutrients is there? Is there lots of nutrients? Is there little nutrients? We're aiming for poor nutrients. But currently there's a lot of nutrients because we're surrounded by farm fields. The weather has an impact. The temperature has an impact. The time of day has an impact because all different animals have different behaviours, whether they come out at night, whether they come out first thing in the morning, whether they're out all day. And the time of year makes an impact as well. What species are we going to see in winter, such as migratory birds? What species we're going to see in spring and summer, again with the migratory birds, and those that have hibernated over the winter months. We need to know the introduced and invasive species. So these two ladybirds are the same species. They are known as the Asian lady beetle, and they are invasive. They're not from the UK, and they actually predate on our native lady beetles' larvae. The larvae of this species does. So they're almost cannibalistic, really. And we need to know the species composition, so how they contribute to the ecosystem. Are they recyclers? Are they pest control? So on and so forth. But how will they respond to restoration work? And will we see increases when there's increases and decreases in habitat types? So here, for those of you that are arachnophobes, I do apologise, but at the Wetland Centre, we have 12 species of arachnids, and 4 of those species are wetland species. So we know that if we're going to increase the wetland habitat, we can start to assume that we're probably going to see populations of these arachnids increase. But what about for the other 8 species of arachnid? Are we going to see decreases in their populations? Or are we going to lose them completely? Those niches that those species had, if we lose those species, are we going to see a new species come in? So we've got to think about all these different things. So we've got the painted cobweb weaver here on the left. We've got at the top, we've got nursery web spiders. Now, these are both the same species, they're just different colours, which is really interesting. So we're seeing differences in single species. On the far right, we've got the common stretch spider, and these like to put their webs up in reeds and along grasses to catch all the mosquitoes that are flying around wetlands. And we've also got this species of harvestman, which a lot of you might be more, or a daddy longlegs, Oligolophus tridens, got it right. And they prefer wetter and wetland habitats. But how do we collect all this data? Well, there's lots of different ways that we collect data, and I'm not going to go through all of it because I bear in mind that you don't want to fall asleep and that England are kicking off shortly. So there's quadrats, which are basically a square, And we can put these all over the site, and we can use these to have an idea of what we find in that area and how it might be distributed across the site, what their population size might be. We can use pitfall traps. These are mainly for beetles and invertebrates that go along the floor, and they fall into the pitfall trap, and you can either have an alcohol solution in there, or you can leave them dry so it's more humane and you can release them back into the wilds. And it's a good way of knowing what we find on the grounds. There's small mammal trapping, obviously for small mammals. We've got tunnel traps for their tracks. There's dipping in the stream. There's so many different types. And we use a whole host of methods to try and understand all the different species and their families available, whether it's plants, whether it's insects, whether it's arachnids or snails and gastropod snails and slugs. There's so many different ways of finding out. But when do we stop? So here in front of you is a species discovery curve. And basically when this plateaus, we know we've found all the species or the majority of the species on the site. And as you can see, it is still on an upward trajectory. So there is still more species to be found. So we're not finished yet. But then again, it's one of those, how are we going to know whether the biodiversity there is a good amount, a high amount, or a bad amount, whether it's poor biodiversity? How do we know that we actually need to restore this habitat? And how do we find out? So this is the way that we do it is through comparison studies with a similar site. But then again, where do we choose that site? Surely we can't find a site that's going to be really similar in all these different ways in terms of the habitats and the water and the surroundings and the history of the site and the goals, to be able to compare the two sites, one before restorative action and one post-restorative action. Well, we're really fortunate that here in Cheshire and in the Chester area, we have such a site, and that's the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve. So there's a wetland area. There's Finchett's Gutter, which is a man-made stream from the agricultural days. There's hedgerows. There's grasslands. There's the Shropshire Union Canal. There's some woodlands. So there's different species that might be moving from those habitats through the wetlands are coming from the same sorts of habitats. So that's a good thing to bear in mind, because at the Chester Wetland Centre, it's the same area. It's still in Cheshire, in the Chester region. There's the similar habitats of the wetland. We've still got Finchett's Gutter. There's a hedgerow, multiple hedgerows. There's grasslands. There's the Shropshire Union Canal. And we have woodlands as well. So the variables are really reduced in terms of what could influence the species moving through the wetland. And both of these sites are surrounded by farmland as well. So the pollutants that could affect one site, it will be quite similar on both sites. And they've both got similar histories being in the same area. That, for those of you that know, Cheshire used to be a prehistoric lake, salt lake. Obviously now it's not. And a lot of it as well was wetlands, and a lot of that has been lost to become an area of agriculture. And that both of these sites are part of the same big picture of creating these green corridors and wildlife connection trails. So back to my hypothesis of a wetland habitat where restorative action has taken place will host a greater diversity of flora and fauna. So what we're looking at is the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve more biologically diverse than the Chester Wetland Centre? Because we need to know this to see whether the work we're going to do at the Chester Wetland Centre, is it worth it? Or is that enough? Does the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve's wetland filter the water better and prevent all the pollutants and nutrients from going into it? And is it able to store more carbon? So when the restorative action takes place, we're aiming that it's going to have a big climate change influence. We're hoping that it's going to influence the water, and we're hoping that it's going to influence the biodiversity and wildlife found there. So we need to compare these two sites. So we've got an idea of how the Chester Wetland Centre might turn out in the end. So that's sort of all my research. It's quite a brief overview because there is a lot of stuff involved in it. But now on to the bit where I want to see where you guys can get involved. So first and foremost, as soon as you get the opportunity, visit the Chester Wetland Centre. It might not seem like much, but there's more there than you realise. Any wildlife that you see at the site, upload it using the apps iNaturalist or Seek or Record Swift, because they share their data with me and I share my data with them once I've got it all sorted out a bit better. Or you're equally welcome to message me something that you've taken a picture of on my Instagram or my Twitter, which I've shown here, and they were sent out on the original emails as well for this talk. After this talk, there's a questionnaire that's going to be sent out. Please, please, please complete it, because this is going to let me know how you guys have engaged and whether I am actually getting my research across and whether you all understand it or whether you've all fallen asleep behind your screens. Keep an eye out for events that potentially might happen in the Chester Wetland Centre. I'm not promising anything because, as you've all seen from the past year, things can change drastically. But we are hoping that at some point in the future, be it summer, that we can get some workshops going potentially. We can get some bio blitzes going, which will give you all an opportunity to get out into the field, to put your wellies on, get a bit wet and muddy, and to have a look for all the different wildlife that's there. Because that is another citizen science aspect. And when visiting the site, I know I'll be preaching to the converted here already, but please stick to the clear pathways. Have none of you seen American Werewolf in London? You don't want to turn into a werewolf, so stick to the pathway. It is a wet area. There is deep water around. It can be dangerous. If you're taking dogs, keep them on leads, because there is ground nesting birds. Quite sadly, the other month, I observed a small population of common snipe. And recently, because of the pathways being all cut up, people have been venturing right out into the marsh grassland, and I've not seen any common snipe there for a month now. Don't drop litter. That's a given for wherever you go. And don't harass or play with the wildlife or pick any plants, because it's all part of the research. That's their home as well. So what we hope for by the end, if you've not managed to understand anything I've said, first and foremost is that I complete my master's degree with a pass or higher, hopefully a higher, and that there'll be a PhD opportunity out of it. Helen, I'm winking at you. That we have an understanding of the species, their populations and their composition to aid in the restoration of the Chester Wetland Centre and to potentially mitigate any loss or changes in biodiversity and to find ways how we might increase it. So what species that could we use as target species? To have an idea through the comparative study as the potential future outcomes of the restoration of the Chester Wetland Centre. Whether it's going to be an increase in biodiversity, whether the water nutrient levels are affected, and whether it does store more carbon. Sorry, I've just gone back there. There we go. To potentially find a way that we can balance the objectives of the Chester Wetland Centre to benefit all, whether it's the carbon sequestration, the flood mitigation, leisure, education, biodiversity. These are all things that we can potentially look into to improve the value of a restoration site such as this, where education can take place, where people can go for a jog, a walk, use it for their own leisure, where it can potentially help people's well-being. We want to look for the potential causes for the increased levels of nutrients and pollutants. So we can already hypothesize that that's potentially going to be the farmland. So this is research that another student is doing, which will also be included within my master's, because I do have to analyze that data as well, but I don't have to do the hard work because I'm doing a lot already. And to aid in the success of the Green Corridor Wildlife Connections Trail, so that it creates an area of recreation, of education, of physical and mental well-being, something that's really important today, where we can prevent or mitigate floods, store carbon, and filter water more naturally. And last of all, to be a leading example in how habitat restoration and wildlife preservation can be done, so that we're not just looking at one goal. Can we actually find a way to include all these goals and aims? So lots of different animals here, lots of different animals through all those slides. So I will ask, you're all welcome, just shove it into the messages if you're able to message, just to see how many different species you've actually spotted. On this last slide is actually some of my more favourite ones that I've come across, because they were we've got common carder bee, we've got the smooth-faced furrow bee. This was actually the first bee that I found on the site. We've got these tiny little moths, common nettle-tap moths. This was one of the first insects I found, which is Nosteria elongata. We have the robin, because they're one of my favourite birds. A really cool caterpillar of the drinker moth. This cool fly. We have hoverflies, moths, and cool red weevil creatures as well. So there is actually, throughout the slides, a number that I've managed to count. You might have counted more or less. There is 49 different species. And I was a bit cheeky because that does include the likes of the white clover that this insect is on, and the creeping thistle that the hoverfly is on, and the ragwort that the bees are on. So I've been a bit sneaky with that. But I hope that sort of demonstrates the whole host of wildlife that we see at the site, and also the potential difficulties and constraints that we might find when we're actually in a field trying to find all these different species. And like I said, I've been out today and there's even more out there today. So it's been super. Thank you for listening to me. These are all my references for anybody that wants to read up a bit more. Thank you all for listening. Like I said, any questions? And just a little extra thanks to Christian Dunn, my supervisor, for helping me get onto this. For Chester Zoo for helping me out, and for Record as well for sharing all their data. To Andy and the Countess of Park, because they've been super support. And to my partner, Emily, and our family, because they hear me babble on about all this stuff all the time, and I don't think they have a clue what I'm on about half the time.